The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge as Rachel Torres pushed through the staff entrance at Oak Creek Memorial, her badge already clipped to the pocket of fresh scrubs, her hair pulled back tight enough to give her a headache by noon. She had learned long ago that invisibility required precision. No jewelry except a simple watch. No personal photos in her locker. No stories about where she'd come from or why she moved between hospitals like smoke drifting through corridors. Just a temp nurse who showed up on time, did the work, and disappeared before anyone thought to ask questions. The ICU smelled like it always did, antiseptic layered over something metallic and organic that no amount of bleach could fully erase. The sounds came next. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms, heart monitors beeped in staggered syncopation, and somewhere down the hall a call light chimed with the persistent irritation of a patient who would probably just need the bathroom. Rachel moved through it all without reaction, her limp barely noticeable on the good days. Today was a good day. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was level. She was a ghost in scrubs, which was exactly how she needed it. The night shift report came at 6:15. She stood at the edge of the group, tablet in hand, taking notes in the abbreviated shorthand that made sense only to people who lived in crisis. Bed 3 was post-op hip replacement, stable, pain-controlled. Bed 5 was pneumonia, responding to antibiotics, oxygen SATs trending up. Bed 8 was a drunk driver who'd be someone else's problem by Tuesday. And room 217 was new. Commander Michael Chen, 61, severe traumatic brain injury from a motorcycle incident in Kandahar 3 weeks ago, evacuated through Bagram, transferred to Walter Reed for initial stabilization, now here at Oak Creek for neuro-recovery and cognitive rehabilitation. Confused, intermittently agitated, responding only to painful stimuli. His daughter was with him. His daughter was a Navy corpsman, which meant she would watch everything Rachel did with the eye of someone who knew exactly what competence looked like. Rachel wrote room 217 on her shift sheet and marked it as her primary assignment. By 7 o'clock she was in room 217, checking the fall-line taped to Commander Chen's left hand, reading the monitors, assessing pupil response with a penlight that he didn't flinch away from. His eyes were the color of storm water, and they looked through her with the blank distance of someone whose brain was still reassembling itself. His daughter sat in the visitor's chair with her military bearing intact, spine straight, shoulders squared, the kind of posture that didn't come from civilian life. She watched Rachel with the particular intensity of family who have learned to trust no one. His pain level is manageable, Rachel said, keeping her voice flat and professional, the voice she wore like a mask. I'll check him every 30 minutes. If anything changes, you can call. She kept her eyes on the monitors, not on the daughter, not on the man who lay unconscious with a tattoo visible on his right forearm where the sheets had shifted. The tattoo was small, faded, the kind that had been applied with field equipment and poor lighting. It read Torres. She adjusted his full line. Her hands were steady. The tremor that sometimes came when she was still didn't appear. She was moving, doing, being useful, and that was when the pretense held best. How long have you been doing this? The daughter asked. Rachel didn't pause in her work. Assigned to Oak Creek for the next 8 weeks. No. How long nursing? A beat. Rachel's jaw clenched slightly, the only tell in her otherwise composed face. Long enough to know what I'm doing. The daughter nodded as if this was sufficient. It wasn't the answer she'd asked for, but it was the answer she would get. By 8 o'clock Rachel was documenting vitals when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway of room 217. He was tall in the way of men who believed their height gave them authority, and he moved through the ICU with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by anything that mattered. His suit was tailored, wool blend, definitely expensive, the kind that signaled board meetings and political networks. He had the kind of jawline that could cut glass and the kind of smile that meant nothing. He glanced at Commander Chen, then at the daughter, then at Rachel. "How's our Admiral doing?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew he was being charming. "Commander, actually," the daughter said. "Coast Guard." "Ah. Well, he's in excellent hands." He gestured vaguely toward Rachel, a motion that managed to be both inclusive and dismissive simultaneously. Our temp staff is quite competent. They handle the technical work while our permanent nurses deal with the more nuanced care requirements. Rachel's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard for exactly 1 beat. Then she resumed charting. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge the insult nested inside the compliment like a bomb in a gift box. She simply continued her work as if he hadn't spoken, as if she were already invisible again. Dr. Hargrove lingered for another moment, watching her, really watching her, his expression shifting from affable to something harder. Rachel could feel it. The change in the room's pressure. The moment a predator recognizes that the small animal moving at the edge of the clearing might not be entirely harmless. "Your charting methodology," he said, not to Rachel specifically, but in her direction. "It's very economical." Rachel continued typing. She was documenting the assessment exactly as protocol required, every vital sign recorded with precision, every notation timed and dated. There was nothing wrong with her documentation. They both knew that. "I prefer thoroughness," Dr. Hargrove continued. "Details that demonstrate comprehensive understanding. Not just the numbers, but the clinical reasoning. The context." "The protocol requires vitals every 30 minutes, Rachel said without looking up. "Neuro checks every 2 hours. I'm following protocol." "Of course you are." He smiled. It was the smile of someone who had just decided something. "Carry on." He left. The room exhaled. The machines resumed their rhythmic beeping. The daughter watched Rachel for a long moment, then looked back at her father, and something shifted in her expression, not suspicion, but recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from seeing someone operate at a level others don't notice. "You've done this before," the daughter said. "More than nursing." Rachel finished her documentation and logged out of the computer. "I do my job." "No. You do it like you've been trained to do it under pressure." Rachel closed the laptop. She turned to face the daughter directly for the first time, and when she did, her eyes were the color of old metal, flat and unreadable. "Everyone here is trained to handle pressure, petty officer. That's the job." The daughter smiled slightly. "You knew my rate without asking. Your bearing. Your watch. The way you sit." Rachel moved toward the door. She had made a mistake, said too much, revealed too much in 3 seconds. "I'll be back for vitals at 8:30. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that as Rachel left room 217 and moved back into the hallway, she had felt Commander Chen's eyes tracking her movement, and for one fractional moment, a single flutter in the machinery of his damaged brain, something had registered. Some fragment of recognition that hadn't yet risen to consciousness. Some buried memory that had almost surfaced before sinking back down into the fog. She had kept her head down for 2 years. She had worked in 7 different hospitals across 3 states. She had changed her hair, modified her gait, learned to make her voice smaller and her hands less certain than they actually were. She had become a ghost precisely because ghosts are what people don't see. And now, in room 217, in a hospital in Denver where no one knew her name or her history or what she was, someone who had known her in another lifetime, someone who had been there, who had seen what she could do, was waking up. The shift bell hadn't even rung for 8:30. The next time Rachel entered room 217, Dr. Hargrove was there again, holding a tablet, reviewing the chart with the expression of a man checking for errors. He looked up as she approached, and the smile he gave her was different now. It was the smile of a hunter who had just caught the scent of something worth pursuing. "Nurse Torres," he said, reading her name badge as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Tell me about your previous positions." Rachel hung the clean for bags on the hook, preparing for the medication change that was due at 8:45. Her hands moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from 1,000 repetitions in trauma bays and field hospitals. She had learned long ago that staying busy was the best defense. "For weeks at Seattle General," she said. 6 weeks at Mount Sinai Grace before that. Various assignments. And before that? She didn't answer. She finished the 4 setup and turned to leave. I'm asking because, Dr. Hargrove said, not unkindly, your technical skills are exceptional. Far beyond what we typically see in temp assignments. It makes one curious about the backstory. Rachel paused at the threshold. When she turned back, her expression was perfectly neutral. I'm here to do the work. Of course. But sometimes the work is all there is if you don't have the right foundation. Education. Credentials. A clear path. He gestured with his tablet. Some people belong in positions of authority. Others belong in supporting roles. It's important to know which is which. There it was. The first cut, carefully placed, designed to test her composure. Not loud enough to be obviously an insult. Just quiet enough to be deniable. Rachel met his eyes for one moment, just long enough for him to see that she understood exactly what he had said and exactly what it meant. I'll check on the medication order, she said. She walked out of the room. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath didn't catch. The tremor that lived in her right hand stayed quiet. And by the time she reached the medication dispensary 3 doors down, she had already decided Dr. Hargrove had marked her as a threat. The question was only how quickly he would try to neutralize it. She had 1 week, maybe 2, before the real pressure began. Hargrove's campaign began during afternoon rounds, when Vanessa Chen appeared at her father's bedside with the kind of quiet authority that only comes from military families. She was a Navy corpsman on leave, all lean shoulders and observant eyes, and she'd been reading her father's medication list while Rachel adjusted his full line. The woman's jaw tightened. "Doctor," Vanessa said, her voice cutting through the ambient hospital noise like a blade through silk, "that dosage combination concerns me." The interaction profile. Hargrove turned from the monitor, his expression shifting into something sharp and predatory. He looked at Vanessa, then at the patient's family gathered by the window, then at Rachel. The calculation happened in real time, visible behind his eyes. "I'm sorry, do you have a medical degree I'm unaware of, Ms. Torres?" His voice was honey smooth, but the knife was already in. "Or do temp nurses at Oak Creek Memorial now practice medicine without a license?" Vanessa's face went pale. The family stopped talking. The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder. Rachel's hand stilled on the 4 pump. 1 measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. The tear that escaped, she didn't try to stop it, didn't look away, didn't shrink. She locked her eyes directly with Hargrove's and spoke so quietly the family had to lean in to hear. "I've stood before better men who tried to break me, doctor." The room went so still you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm. Hargrove's face flushed. He wasn't used to being matched. He wasn't used to a temp nurse with a voice that sounded like it had given orders in sandstorms. He turned away sharply, his shoe squeaking on the polished tile as he moved toward the unit board. During shift change, with the nursing staff filtering through and fresh eyes everywhere, he uncapped a red marker and wrote Rachel's name in capital letters. Policy violations, insubordination. His handwriting was aggressive, the letters heavy-handed and leaning forward like a threat. Other nurses glanced at the board. Some looked away. Some held their stare just long enough for Rachel to feel the weight of it. By the next morning, she already knew how this worked. The break room was a small box of beige walls and a refrigerator that hummed like a wounded animal. Rachel sat at the corner table with a salad and a bottle of water, her hands folded around the bottle because keeping them still required focus. Jennifer approached first, grabbed a coffee mug from the cabinet. Marcus was already there, scrolling through his phone. Paula came in carrying a stack of charts. They all froze when they saw her. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Jennifer remembered she had a documentation task. Marcus realized he needed to check on something in the med room. Paula's pager suddenly chirped with an urgent message. Their chairs scraped back with the sound of betrayal, and she sat alone under the flickering light that sputtered like a heartbeat losing rhythm. Rachel didn't look up. She cut her salad into smaller pieces than necessary, each gesture precise and controlled, the kind of control that comes from standing in places where showing weakness meant not going home. She'd been isolated before. She'd been colder than this. She'd been hungrier. But there was something about the break room silence that landed differently, not because of the abandonment, but because of how practiced it was. These were people she'd worked beside for 4 months. People she'd stayed late for when their patients tanked. People she'd held when they cried in supply closets. That afternoon, Hargrove called an impromptu staff meeting in the conference room. Rachel felt it coming before it happened, the way administrative predators always move in visible circles before the strike. She walked in and took a seat at the far end of the table, her back straight, her face blank. Hargrove stood at the front like he owned the room, his tie perfectly knotted, his posture broadcasting authority the way it always did. "We've had concerns," he began, his eyes finding Rachel's, "about Nurse Torres's documentation practices. Her temp agency file is remarkably sparse." "What exactly are you hiding, temp?" He let the word sit there like a slur. "Not nurse. Not Ms. Torres. Temp." Other staff studied their shoes. The attending physician, Dr. Morris, suddenly became very interested in the edge of the table. One of the charge nurses looked like she wanted to say something, then didn't. Rachel stood. One measured breath, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It was the voice of someone who'd been trained to give orders across radio frequencies that could barely hear her, and it landed like a physical force. "Nothing that concerns you, Doctor." She walked out before he could respond. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Hargrove was left holding air, his mouth open, his face darkening like a sunset nobody wanted to watch. Back in Commander Chen's room, the patient lay with his eyes tracking something invisible, his brain injury creating a man who was present in body but absent everywhere that mattered. Rachel pulled up the chair and adjusted his pillows, gentle work, the kind that didn't require recognition. His arm shifted, and she could see the tattoo clearly now. Her own name in faded blue ink, done in some dusty alleyway in Kandahar where the dust got into everything and never quite left. He'd gotten it the day they'd found him on the roadside 3 kilometers from where the IED took his unit. She'd carried him out, 3 miles through enemy fire with his arm around her neck and his blood running hot down her ribs, and she'd never told anyone because talking about it would have meant admitting she'd been carrying more than his weight. She'd been carrying the weight of being seen. Now he stared through her without seeing anything at all. Vanessa came in carrying fresh water, her movements precise and practiced. "Thank you for what you said in rounds." She set the pitcher down carefully. "My father wouldn't have recognized a medication error, but you did. That took knowledge. That took..." She paused, searching for the word. "That took experience." Rachel turned away and adjusted the monitor leads. "Just doing the job." "No." Vanessa's voice was sharp. "You were doing more than the job." "Kandahar." Rachel's hand stilled on the monitor cable. The room seemed to contract. "He talks about it sometimes," Vanessa continued. "When the medication is right and his head's working. About a chief who carried him out when everyone else was pinned down. He never gave a name. Just said a Reaper got him home." She looked at the tattoo on her father's arm, then at Rachel. "He got a tattoo of the name afterward. Said it was the only way he knew to thank someone he couldn't remember. Isn't that something?" Rachel's jaw tightened. She could feel the taut wire of control pulling tight across her ribs. "Your father was a good Marine. A good man. That's what matters." The machines beeped their electronic rhythm. Somewhere down the hallway, a code was being called. The hospital moved forward the way it always did, indifferent to the histories written inside it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:44 p.m., when Commander Chen's breathing changed. It started subtle. Rachel caught it because she'd been watching him constantly, the way you watch something you'd almost lost before. His chest rose unevenly. The left side of his ribcage stayed compressed a fraction too long. His oxygen saturation, which had been stable at 94, began drifting down. 92, 90. 88. Rachel's hand reached for the call button, smooth and immediate. I need respiratory to room 217. Now. Dr. Morris arrived within minutes, looking harried and slightly lost. He was a good attending in routine moments, but his hands moved with the hesitation of someone who'd never learned how to move fast when it counted. He reached for his stethoscope with fumbling fingers. Rachel's training took over, not her civilian training, not her temp nurse training, but the other training. The kind that lives in muscle memory and doesn't need permission. Tension pneumothorax. Left-sided collapse, pressure building. He needs needle decompression immediately. I'm the attending, Dr. Morris said, but his voice wavered. Rachel was already moving. A 14-gauge angiocath needle. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The hiss of air escaping, that sound, the release of pressure that meant the difference between life and the alternative. Commander Chen's oxygen saturation climbed immediately. 89, 92. 95, 97. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. The room went dead silent. The hiss of released pressure hung in the air like a benediction. Commander Chen's oxygen saturation climbed steadily, 75, 82, 88, his breathing deepening into something that resembled survival. Rachel's hands were already moving toward the supply cart before Dr. Morris even opened his mouth, muscle memory operating on a frequency that bypassed hesitation entirely. The needle had gone exactly where it needed to go. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Textbook. Except textbooks didn't account for the way her hands remembered Kandahar, didn't account for the dozen times she'd performed this same decompression on sailors bleeding into their own chests while incoming mortars shook the deck beneath her boots. That was, Dr. Morris's voice cracked like he'd just watched someone defuse a bomb with tweezers. His eyes moved between Rachel and the monitor as if he couldn't quite believe the numbers climbing across the screen. You performed an emergency needle decompression. Tension pneumothorax, Rachel said quietly, already checking the commander's pulse. He wasn't breathing. The needle relieved the pressure. She kept her tone clinical, matter-of-fact, the way any competent nurse would explain a routine intervention. Not the way a senior chief petty officer with 3 Purple Hearts would sound. She pulled back from the bedside, retreated into the corner where temp nurses belonged, and let Dr. Morris take the credit he was already mentally preparing to claim. Vanessa Chen stood frozen at her father's bedside, her Navy corpsman training wrestling with what she'd just witnessed. The kind of intervention that required either advanced certification or 18 years of muscle memory operating on automatic. Rachel didn't make eye contact. Didn't acknowledge the question forming behind Vanessa's eyes. She'd learned long ago that invisibility was a gift you gave yourself, that staying in the shadows kept the shadows from swallowing you whole. That invisibility lasted until Linda Chen, the monitoring supervisor, not Vanessa, the different Chen, picked up the phone at the nurse's station and made a call that would echo through Oak Creek Memorial like a grenade with the pin pulled. Hargrove arrived in the ICU 20 minutes later, his footsteps sharp on the tile like a prosecutor entering a courtroom. He moved directly past the other stations, directly past the patients whose oxygen saturations were climbing, directly toward Rachel at the medication cart where she was methodically documenting the emergency decompression in the chart. Not hiding. Not running. Just standing there the way soldiers stand, present and accountable. Dr. Hargrove, Rachel said without turning. Commander Chen is stable. Sinus rhythm, improving oxygen sat, breath sounds bilateral. I'm not here about the commander's clinical status, Hargrove said. His voice carried the particular menace of a man who'd just been handed a loaded weapon. I'm here about an unauthorized invasive procedure performed by someone whose certification status is, at best, questionable. The words were careful. Calculated. Designed to plant seeds of doubt about Rachel's credibility before anyone had time to ask whether she'd actually saved the patient's life. Rachel turned slowly. Met his eyes with the kind of flat stare that had made interrogators in Kandahar uncomfortable enough to end their questioning. The procedure was indicated, Rachel said. The patient was exsanguinating into his own thorax. Then the attending physician should have performed it. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He was already building the narrative, Rachel could see it playing out behind his eyes. Already calculating how to weaponize her competence into evidence of her recklessness. As chief of medicine at this institution, I have a responsibility to ensure proper protocols are followed. Especially when we have a military patient whose case might draw scrutiny. He didn't say it, but Rachel heard it anyway. That she was a liability. That her presence, especially near a decorated officer, opened doors that needed to stay locked. That whatever she'd just done, whatever she'd just proven she could do, was now evidence of danger rather than skill. Hargrove pulled his phone from his pocket before he'd even left the ICU. Rachel watched him walk toward the administrative corridor, already dialing. She knew that look. The look of a man activating his network. The look of someone who understood that power wasn't built through honest effort but through relationships leveraged at exactly the right moment. By the time Rachel finished her shift at 7 p.m., Hargrove had already called Patricia Westmore, the board's vice chair, from his car in the parking lot. She could imagine it perfectly, Hargrove's carefully modulated voice, his tone of concern rather than accusation, his way of reframing everything. "Patricia, I hate to trouble you before your morning meetings tomorrow, but we have a liability situation that's escalating." That's how he would have started. Not angry. Concerned. The voice of a competent administrator protecting his institution. One of our temp ICU nurses performed an invasive procedure, a needle decompression, actually, without physician authorization. On a Coast Guard officer, no less. Her credentials are incomplete. Her judgment is clearly compromised. I'm handling it through proper channels, of course, but I wanted you to be aware that if this became public, the optics would be. He'd pause there, let Patricia fill in the blank. Malpractice lawsuit. Regulatory investigation. Bad press. Patricia would have asked the right questions, the ones that made it sound like she was protecting the hospital rather than protecting Hargrove. By 8 p.m., Hargrove had already contacted Maya Personnel Services, the temp agency that supplied Rachel's assignments. His call would have been brisk, businesslike, the tone of a physician who discovered a serious problem. "I need to make you aware of some concerning incidents with one of your nurses. Rachel Torres. 2 separate incidents in the past 48 hours involving questionable judgment and unauthorized procedures. I'm documenting this for our credentialing committee, but in the interest of transparency, you should know that we may need to terminate her assignment." The temp agency would listen carefully. Documentation mattered. Hospitals were their bread and butter. One bad placement, one liability claim, and their entire operation could suffer. Hargrove knew this. He was betting on it. By 10 p.m., the outside investigator was already being contacted, a retired hospital administrator named Dr. Gerald Voss who specialized in credentialing disputes and had done work for at least 15 institutions in the Denver area. Hargrove's connection to Voss was indirect but solid. A colleague from a conference 3 years ago. A referral from Patricia Westmore. The kind of relationship that meant Voss would approach Rachel's case with the assumption that smoke meant fire. "Gerald, I need to engage your firm for an urgent credentialing review," Hargrove would have said. A temp nurse performed an invasive procedure on a high-profile patient without authorization. "I need a complete assessment of her qualifications and decision-making processes. The hospital needs this documented thoroughly before we proceed with any disciplinary action." Voss would agree. Of course he would. This was his business model, institutions paying for independent reviews that somehow always reached conclusions that aligned with whatever the paying institution had already decided. Rachel drove home through Denver's rain-slicked streets, her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing measured and deliberate. She'd known, the moment the needle went in and Commander Chen's oxygen saturation began climbing, that she'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade. Not because the procedure was wrong. It was right. Indicated. Life-saving. But because doing the right thing in a hospital run by men like Hargrove meant you'd exposed yourself. You'd shown what you were capable of. And capable was dangerous. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Denver's Baker neighborhood, the kind of place that asked no questions and provided no permanence. 6 months, maybe 9 if she was lucky. The lease was month to month. Her furniture was sparse, arranged for rapid departure. A bed, a desk, a single bookshelf. The jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining hung in the closet, buried behind the scrubs and civilian clothes she wore to make herself smaller. Rachel sat on the edge of her bed at 11:16 p.m., fully dressed, and waited for the phone call she knew was coming. It arrived at 6:32 a.m., delivered by HR in the form of a message asking her to report to the administration office at 8 a.m. for an urgent meeting with Dr. Hargrove. She didn't sleep. Instead, she reviewed what she'd done. The needle decompression had been textbook. Indicated. Life-saving. There was no scenario in which it was medically wrong. But medicine wasn't measured in what was right. It was measured in hierarchy, in credentials, in who had the authority to make decisions and who had the responsibility to follow them. Rachel had crossed that line. She'd acted like someone who knew what they were doing, rather than someone who was supposed to defer to the attending physician's judgment. The administration office smelled like coffee and the particular sterility of institutional spaces designed to feel official and authoritative. Hargrove sat behind a desk that had been positioned to put him at eye level above anyone sitting across from him. A power move so obvious it bordered on theatrical. Beside him sat a woman Rachel didn't recognize, HR, probably, there to document the termination and ensure it followed whatever procedures meant the hospital couldn't be sued. "Rachel, thank you for coming in," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a man about to deliver bad news he'd practiced in the mirror. "I'm sure you're aware that we've had some concerns raised about your performance over the past 2 days. An unauthorized invasive procedure, questions about your credentials, questions about your judgment in the field. We've initiated a formal investigation through an independent credentialing firm. In the meantime, given the sensitive nature of your assignment, the hospital has decided to suspend your temporary placement pending the outcome of that review." Rachel's hand went to her badge without being asked. She unclipped it from her scrubs and set it carefully on Hargrove's desk. It was a small piece of plastic that had given her access to a hospital for 47 days. Now it was evidence. "The suspension is effective immediately," HR said, sliding a packet of papers across the desk. "Your final paycheck will include payment through today. You'll need to return your hospital ID and your access credentials. Security can escort you to collect your belongings." Rachel stood. One measured breath. The kind of breath that came from having already survived the worst the world had to offer. She walked to the closet where her jacket hung, pulled it down from its hanger, and felt the reassuring weight of the faded unit patch inside the lining. Proof. Documentation. The only evidence left that she had ever been anything more than a temp nurse who couldn't follow orders. She didn't cry. Didn't shake. Didn't let her composure crack for even a moment. She simply walked out of Oak Creek Memorial with the jacket over her arm and the rain starting to fall outside the hospital windows like applause for a performance nobody was watching. Room 217 smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness that comes from recirculated air running too long without fresh oxygen. Rachel stood at Commander Chen's bedside during the noon assessment, reading the ventilator settings the way other people read headlines, automatic, efficient, already thinking 3 steps ahead. His oxygen saturation had been holding steady at 94% for 6 hours. His heart rate sat at 78. Normal. Stable. The kind of patient who looked like he was finally turning a corner, which meant the real danger was exactly now, when everyone exhaled and stopped watching so closely. The attending, Dr. Marcus Wells, moved through the assessment with the distracted precision of a man reviewing his lunch options. Rachel had worked with Wells twice before. He was competent in a way that meant he'd never killed anyone, but he was also the kind of doctor who saw patients as problems on a checklist rather than human beings whose lungs could collapse without warning. He listened to Chen's chest. He noted the numbers. He was already moving toward the door when Rachel noticed something that made her spine straighten. Chen's breathing had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would register on the monitor for another 30 seconds. But Rachel had spent 3 years treating trauma patients in field conditions where you learn to read the body's language before the machines did, because machines could lie and bodies never did. The slight shallowing. The way his right shoulder lifted half an inch higher than it should. The subtle asymmetry that meant one lung was working alone. "Wait," Rachel said quietly. Not a question. Not a request. Dr. Wells paused at the doorway, hand still on the frame. Something? Rachel was already reaching for the stethoscope around her neck, knowing she had maybe 90 seconds before this became a code. Right side breath sounds absent. His distended, his trachea's deviating. See? Tension pneumothorax. We need to decompress. Wells turned back, and Rachel saw the exact moment his brain caught up with the clinical reality. His jaw tightened. His eyes went to the monitor. The oxygen saturation had dropped to 89. Chen's heart rate spiked to 127. The ventilator labored, pushing air into one lung while the other collapsed against his ribs like a fist clenching. "Get a chest tube kit," Wells said, already moving back toward the bed. But Rachel was already moving. Her hands found the landmarks by muscle memory that predated this hospital, predated civilian nursing, predated everything except the training that lived in her bones. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle was 14 gauge, long enough to reach the pleural space but short enough to avoid the major vessels that ran below the ribs. She had swabbed the site with chlorhexidine and found the rib without thinking, the way her body knew how to do things her mind had tried to forget. Wells froze. That was the moment Rachel understood that everything had just changed in ways the monitor couldn't measure. Because needle decompression wasn't a nurse's procedure. It wasn't even a temp nurse's procedure. It was beyond her scope, beyond her authority, beyond the invisible lines that kept people like her in their place. But the physics of tension pneumothorax didn't care about scope of practice. Pressure was pressure. Collapsed lung was collapsed lung. And Rachel's hands knew the angle because they had done this exact thing in a desert compound in Kandahar with artillery rounds landing close enough to shake sand from the ceiling. She felt the needle slide through skin, through fascia, through the intercostal muscle. Then the hiss, that specific sound of pressurized air escaping, the sound of a lung re-inflating, the sound of someone's chest cavity finally understanding it could work again. 90 seconds. The oxygen saturation climbed. 89 to 91 to 94. His heart rate dropped from 127 to 103 to 88. The ventilator's rhythm smoothed out. Chen's breath came easier, his right shoulder lowering back to its normal position. Wells had his hand on her shoulder, his voice distant, "Good catch." That was, "You just saved his life." But Rachel was already cleaning up the needle, already disposing of the contaminated materials, already smoothing back into the background where she'd learned to exist. She didn't respond. She didn't acknowledge. She just moved to check the peripheral lines, the Foley catheter, the medication drip, all the small invisible tasks that held a human body together. Her pulse was steady. Her hands weren't shaking. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the particular kind of composure that came from knowing she'd just done exactly what she'd spent 6 months trying not to be. Security arrived 14 minutes later. Rachel was preparing the discharge paperwork for a different patient when the 2 uniforms materialized in the ICU doorway, and she knew before they walked toward her that Hargrove had already made his move. She'd expected it. She'd probably accelerated it. You didn't perform emergency medical procedures outside your scope and walk away unexamined, even if those procedures kept people breathing. Rachel Torres, the older one, said. His name tag read Michaels. He looked like the kind of security guard who'd worked hospital protocol long enough to know that nobody wanted to be the person escorting a staff member out of the building. "That's me," Rachel said. "Dr. Hargrove has asked us to escort you from the premises pending a formal investigation into unauthorized medical procedures performed on a patient under his care. You'll need to surrender your ID badge and any hospital equipment. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending review." Rachel didn't argue. She didn't ask for clarification. She simply pulled the badge from around her neck, the temporary laminated thing that had given her 7 weeks of anonymity and minimum wage stability, and placed it in Michael's outstretched hand. She gathered her belongings from the break room locker, a jacket with a faded unit patch sewn into the lining from a life she'd promised herself she'd left behind, a water bottle, a phone with no photos and minimal contacts. "You're welcome to use the employee exit," the younger guard said quietly. He was maybe 25, with the careful politeness of someone who'd been trained to remove humans from buildings without escalating the situation. "And for what it's worth, everyone saw what you did." "For Chen. That was—" "I know," Rachel interrupted gently. "It was outside my scope." She walked out of Oak Creek Memorial with her jacket over her arm because the Denver afternoon was warm, the kind of warm that belonged to a place that wasn't Kandahar. The parking lot stretched in front of her, all asphalt and white lines and vehicles that would carry people home to lives that made sense. She stood for a moment by the ambulance bay, watching a paramedic team load a stretcher with the casual efficiency of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Her phone had been vibrating against her leg for the last 3 minutes. She pulled it out and saw 6 missed calls from Maya, her sister, who asked every Sunday where Rachel was living and what she was doing and whether she'd like to come home to Seattle for the holidays. Rachel had never told Maya why she'd stopped wearing her uniform. Never explained the VA waiting room 6 months ago, the intake forms, the realization that she'd spent so long keeping everyone else alive that she'd forgotten how to live herself. She didn't answer. She just turned the phone face down and waited for the rain that the forecast had promised, the rain that was starting now in scattered drops that accelerated to something harder, something that sounded like applause for a performance nobody was watching. The parking lot darkened. An ambulance pulled away, lights flashing. Somewhere inside the hospital, Hargrove was probably on the phone already, securing board approval for her termination, making sure his narrative about policy violations and unauthorized procedures became the official record before anyone thought to ask about the needle decompression that had actually saved Commander Chen's life. Inside room 217, Chen's oxygen saturation held at 96%. His heart rate maintained a steady 82. His daughter Vanessa had stepped out to get coffee but would return to find her father stabilized, his breathing easy again, and would wonder for the next 12 hours why everyone kept looking at her with strange expressions when she asked where the nurse named Rachel had gone. The attending Dr. Wells would write a note in the chart that Rachel's quick assessment likely prevented a fatal outcome, but he would also note that the needle decompression had occurred outside standard protocol, which meant the note would be read carefully by lawyers and administrators rather than celebrated. Rachel sat down on the curb at the edge of the parking lot, the rain running down her face, mixing with a particular exhaustion that came from using skills she'd buried too deep to excavate without destroying something else in the process. She had been looking for a place where she could be invisible. She had found one, for 7 weeks, until the universe had reminded her that some things don't stay buried, they just wait for the pressure to build until they explode anyway. The parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial stretched out in front of Rachel Torres like a runway she was walking away from, her cardboard box balanced against her hip. Everything she'd brought into the hospital, 7 weeks of invisibility, of controlled breaths, of hands that knew exactly where to go in a crisis, fit inside 12 inches of compressed cardboard and packing tape. Her badge was gone. Turned in at security with the kind of finality that feels like a door slamming behind you underwater. The October wind carried the smell of diesel exhaust from the ambulance bay, mixing with the antiseptic that had soaked into her scrub so deeply she'd probably never wash it out. Ambulances came and went, their sirens wailing like they had somewhere urgent to be, like the world hadn't just folded up her purpose and filed it away. She'd come to Denver to disappear. Not from the law. From herself. 6 months ago, she'd been sitting in a VA waiting room in San Diego, filling out intake forms with a ballpoint pen that kept running out of ink. Military family section. Service-related injuries. Reason for visit. She'd written in the boxes with a hand that had held together 847 surgical bleeding points and now couldn't stop trembling enough to keep her signature straight. That was the moment, not when the diagnosis came back, not when the symptoms started, not when she'd finally admitted she couldn't sleep more than 90 minutes without the dreams coming back. It was sitting in that waiting room, wearing a hospital gown instead of standing over one, that she realized the woman she'd been, Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, call sign Reaper, the 160th SAW Night Stalkers had sent out on every impossible mission because she was the one who brought people home. That woman had already died. She'd just been moving her body around for another year, pretending it still worked the way it was supposed to. So she'd walked away. Not from the Coast Guard. That was official, all paperwork and retirement ceremonies and the formal kind of goodbye that gets typed on official letterhead. She'd walked away from the person the paperwork proved she was. 3 tours. 12 years of service. 2 Purple Hearts from Kandahar. She'd walked away from all of it and found a temp agency in Denver with a woman named Charlotte who'd asked very few questions and offered positions that didn't require background checks beyond the standard nursing licensing verification. Rachel had deliberately not listed her military service on the application. Buried it. Erased it. Became just another RN looking for shift work, flexible schedule, no questions about why she left her last position or why her employment history had a 2-month gap that she marked as personal leave. The faded unit patch was sewn into the jacket lining. It sat against her ribs like a secret that was slowly poisoning her. She'd told herself that keeping it meant something. A reminder of who she'd been. Proof that the honors weren't hallucinations. Sometimes, in the ICU bathroom at 2 in the morning when she was running a medication drip that was keeping someone alive, she'd reach inside her jacket and touch the fabric. The embroidering had worn thin from 7 years of fingers pressing against it. The colors had faded to something that looked like a ghost of itself, which seemed appropriate. That's what she was. A ghost of a senior chief petty officer, haunting hospital corridors in borrowed scrubs, helping people stay alive while she was slowly learning how to be a person again. Except Commander Chen's tattoo had been the color of ink that never faded. And she'd spent 7 weeks knowing that the man in room 217 was Michael Chen, call sign Butcher, who'd saved her life in a sandstorm outside Jolan district when a Taliban ambush turned the Elzaid into a funeral pyre. He had her name written across his forearm in letters that should have recognized hers. Should have remembered. That's what she'd been counting on, his memory staying fractured, his brain injury keeping the past locked away where it couldn't reach her. As long as he didn't remember, she could stay invisible. But she'd performed emergency needle decompression on him anyway. Hands moving on pure muscle memory when his chest was collapsing and every doctor in the room was frozen. 14-gauge needle. Second intercostal space. The hiss of air escaping the pneumothorax, O2 sat climbing from 68 to 91 to 97. Her hands remembering what her brain had tried to forget. Dr. Hargrove had seen that. Had watched her save a life with precision that couldn't possibly match the credentials of a temporary ICU nurse from a staffing agency. So he'd built a case against her the way men with institutional power always do, quietly, methodically, using the system as a weapon. By morning, she'd been suspended pending investigation. By afternoon, her badge was surrendered and the cardboard box was full of her personal items. The rain started at 4:56 p.m. October in Denver meant the temperature would drop 17 degrees before sunset. Rachel stood in the parking lot with the box balanced against her sternum, watching a Black Hawk helicopter pass overhead, military, not civilian, the rotor wash different from the medevac birds that came through here regularly. The sound of it made something clench in her chest. The 160th SAW Night Stalkers. That could have been her bird. That could have been her call sign crackling through radio static. That could have been her entire world, if she hadn't walked away. She tried to save that part of her life by drowning it. By finding a job where nobody asked questions, in a city where nobody knew her name. By hiding the unit patch like it was something shameful instead of something that had cost her blood and sanity to earn. And it had almost worked. 7 weeks of perfect invisibility. 7 weeks of being just a nurse. Until she became the person she'd been trying to escape. The rain hammered against the parking lot like applause for a show that was over, like the universe laughing at her for thinking she could actually disappear. She stood there with the cardboard box, her jacket soaked through, watching the ER entrance where families were arriving with ambulances behind them. Someone was bleeding somewhere. Someone's monitor was about to start alarming. Someone needed a senior chief petty officer with steady hands and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. And she was standing in the parking lot in the rain with her badge surrendered, which was when her phone rang. The number was Oak Creek Memorial's main line. She almost didn't answer. Almost let it go to voicemail. Let this chapter close completely. Let the cardboard box be the final statement. She'd come, she'd tried, she'd been found out, and now she was leaving. But she answered. Because some part of her was still a senior chief petty officer, and senior chief petty officers answered when people called. Ms. Torres. It was Vanessa Chen, the Navy corpsman daughter, and her voice was shaking in a way that Rachel hadn't heard before, not uncertainty, but something like urgency wrapped in controlled panic. You need to come back. Right now. He's awake. He's lucid. He's asking for you. Commander Chen. He came to during the afternoon assessment. His memory is coming back. He keeps asking where you are. He's saying, Vanessa's voice dropped lower. He's saying something that sounds like a call sign. He's saying the Reaper. Ms. Torres, he's saying your code name. I don't understand how, but he's demanding to talk to you. The hospital administration is already calling. They want to know why a Coast Guard commander is asking for someone who just got suspended. Can you come back? Rachel stood in the rain with the cardboard box and her surrendered badge, and for the first time in 7 weeks, she felt something crack open inside her chest that wasn't fear. The universe wasn't laughing at her for trying to disappear. It was calling her back home. I'm on my way, she said, and the woman who stepped back into Oak Creek Memorial wasn't wearing borrowed scrubs anymore. She was wearing the weight of everything she'd been trying to run from, and it fit exactly right. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And if this video taught you something about facing who you are instead of running from it, like this video and drop a comment. Tell us a story about a time you discovered your real strength was hiding in plain sight. Thanks for listening.